Season of Discovery has lost 93% of its raiding population since the May 27th developer announcement of slowing down work on SOD. There are just shy of 3,000 active raiders on the US-based realms, and SOD is in its era state. The developers have stated there are no plans to shut down the SOD realms, and they hope to see the game mode continue to operate similar to WoW Classic era. Now, as someone who has played the classic era of the game since fall of 2022, there are some glaring issues with Season of Discovery as an era experience that will cause it to collapse upon itself. I still organize and raid lead both a Naxx and a Scarlet Enclave raid on Crusader Strike. I believe SOD can thrive as an era experience, but there needs to be tweaks made to the game mode through a small quality of life patch in order for it to work. The first issue is the lack of connected realms and the lack of connecting players who want SOD era. On my server, Crusader Strike US, there are just under 700 active Alliance raiders. Raids are hard to come by and are always organized through Discords versus Pug pop-ups during the day. Wild Growth has twice the number of active Alliance raiders, from 700 to about 450 on Wild Growth. To triple the raid population for our faction would vastly increase the number of raiders and runs that can be organized. And I've found that players want to continue to raid, but there are just only a handful of people willing to put in the time and effort to organize runs. Now, for instance, on Sunday night, the Raised by Wolves guild on Crusader Strike US ran Scarlet Enclave and had a full 40-person raid, with plenty of players on the bench unable to get into the raid. Having merged servers or even a few extra bodies that are actively raiding can make that 40-person raid into two 30-player raids pretty easily. Now, more activity spurs on more activity, and people want to get connected and plugged in, and it becomes easier for raid leaders to organize runs. So, what can Blizzard do? Well, for Classic Era, Blizzard connected realms into server clusters to essentially mirror a mega server for players that still wanted to play Era. I would advocate Blizzard connecting the Wild Growth and Crusader Strike realms. But if there's an issue connecting PvE and PvP servers, I would just simply call for free character moves to be implemented from Crusader Strike to Wild Growth and vice versa. Just open up free character moves to all the different servers and let the players determine where the hub should be moving forward. Blizzard doesn't need to tell people, hey, everybody needs to be on the PvP server or everybody needs to be on the PvE server, but players can essentially self-select to those different experiences. As somebody who is over on the PvP server, I would be absolutely open to and wanting to be over on the PvE if that meant there was a higher raid population and a healthier server community. The next issue is that the entry into raiding is just too big for a new player. If the goal is to experience all the content that SOD has to offer for a new player who's maybe never experienced it before, you want to get into Scarlet Enclave. Now, we're going to work backwards a little bit. How does somebody get into Scarlet Enclave? Well, they need to be geared for it, and to get geared for it, you need to get into Naxx. You want to get tier 3, you want to get the relative items that are helpful, that put you in a position to say, yes, you should take me to the run. Now, how do you get into Naxx? Well, back on Classic Era, what you would need to do is you need to hit 60, hop into some ZG, maybe run Molten Core, and get enough gear to get into a BWL. And then after BWL gearing, you get into AQ, and you keep going until you get into Naxx. Well, that's a nice tiered system, and that's really helpful because if you're a fresh 60, sure, you can go and do Zul'Gurub and Onyxia pretty easily, same with Molten Core. But as a new player, do I need to do those same runs in order to get into SOD Naxx? The answer is no. SOD Naxx, the barrier to entry into that are two different things. You need to have an appropriate seal rank for the hard mode that you're running, if it's a hard mode 2, hard mode 3 or 4, whatever it might be, which is farmed through Remnants of Valor. And the other barrier to entry is the number of sanctified gear pieces you have. The question is, does Molten Core, BWL, and AQ, do those have sanctified pieces to get at Naxx? No. No, they do not. What you do for a new player at this phase in the game is you actually go into either Karazhan Crypts, where you can go ahead and get sanctified gear through running that dungeon, which you need gear to get into because, even when the developers announced that they were doing Kara Crypts, they said it's no joke as a 5-man and you need to have appropriate gear for it. Or the more common way now, if you're fresh 60, is you need to get BOE crafted Scarlet gear from the Scarlet Enclave patterns that drop in the raid and outside of New Avalon. And so, if you want to get an Naxx Rammus, I really don't care if you have full AQ gear. What I primarily care about is your rank seal that you have, and if you have 8 sanctified pieces to get into Naxx Rammus. And those can be blue BOE pieces. That is better than AQ gear because they make your HP and damage or healing scale with the number of sanctified pieces that you have. So, what does it look like for somebody to get those pieces? If I wanted to get number 1, the BOE crafted gears, it costs a lot. If you are new, you need funds to do that. And at this point in the game, if you farm raw materials out in the open world, that's probably actually pretty good, and those are pretty expensive on the AH, so you can get there over time, which is nice. But then the other barrier to entry would be the Remnants of Valor. Now, Remnants of Valor are either farmed through running Karazhan Crypts, which is a great dungeon if you're able to get into it, but the issue is that not a lot of people are running Karazhan Crypts at this point in time. What people primarily do on SOD era is you run Scarlet Enclave. People just want to go out and, raid the most recent raid, or maybe even Naxx Rammus. Beyond that, there's not a ton of activity on a smaller server like Crusader Strike to actually get into Karazhan Crypts to farm the Remnants of Valor. What are the other ways? Well, you can go to Stratholme. There's a few Remnants of Valor that drop, not a ton, but some. Once again, it requires other people to run with you. If you're a new player, you need to have friends that will essentially carry you through the dungeon, and a lot of people don't want to do that at this point in time, or there're just not as many people to run the group with because it's a smaller server at this point in time. So those are already kind of high barrier to entries as a fresh 60. What is the other option? The other option is doing the incursions farm. And through the incursions, you would do the quest to get the Heart of Doom, which is turned in for additional Remnants of Valor. This is the best way to farm up your seal if you are new to the SOD era experience. But incursions are not soloable as a fresh 60, and I really have not seen any group stand up for or give time to a new player to help them farm for the Remnants. So this is a really big barrier of entry for the new player in the raid scene. What I would do or advocate for Blizzard at this phase of the game is to make Remnants of Valor no longer account bound, but essentially tradable resources. So if somebody's new to the game and they say, hey, I'm looking to get plugged into the raid scene, they don't have this artificial wall of not having a rank 4 seal or a rank 7 seal to get into a Naxx Rammus raid right at 60, but they can go to the AH and buy them, or they can trade with a guild member if they're new into a guild. And there are so many of these laying around that I don't foresee any sort of issue with some people hoarding a bunch of gold, essentially selling them to these fresh 60s. I think there's so many around on characters that they would flow and be really cheap for anybody to buy and get plugged in. So my call would be make these BOEs, don't make them account bound at the end of the day. This would allow for people to get plugged in more easily and more readily. Another issue that we're experiencing on SOD at this point in time is the lack of wild strikes. Now, as SOD moves further into an era state, it's becoming way more common to miss a given class or role in a given raid. It could be a Shadow Priest, it could be a Boomy missing, their debuff for the rogues, etc. But this becomes particularly an issue when it comes to Alliance and Feral Druids. Everyone knows how horrible it feels to be as a melee and not have Windfury. Melee players would rather forego a raid versus not having Windfury or Wild Strikes on SOD. And this is mostly an Alliance problem, as at least Shamans can drop Windfury as needed for melee groups on Horde. But for Alliance, on Crusader Strike for instance, I have the biggest difficulty finding a Wild Strike Feral. And if it's an issue when it comes to recruitment, as if I'm advertising a run that is still looking for a Feral Druid, the other melee players aren't keen to sign up for the raid unless knowing there is a Windfury for them. As an example, this past week we ran a Naxx, and one of our raiders dual boxed his Ret Pally with his fresh level 60 Druid that he power leveled. He just had the Druid on auto follow, finding safe spots not to take damage, while staying alive just to provide wild strikes to the raid. We had a 30-person raid, and there was one fresh level 60 Druid that was just dual boxed and provided wild strikes to the raid. Now, I'm encouraging players to make Druid alts so we can have more ferals down the road, but it's a tall task. As SOD moves further into an era state, there's a population that is going to be of already geared players that don't want to necessarily make new tunes, but just want to keep playing their existing tunes. For instance, already geared players who just want to take their Ashbringers into raid and just blast. Warriors with Ashbringer have told me that Phase 8 Fury is the most fun they've ever had playing Fury Warrior. Now, as somebody who's played Classic Era for almost 3 now, I learned that that type of player that enjoys this era experience can be akin to somebody who owns like a sports car. That sports car owners sometimes just want to go for a joyride with the top down. Inside era players who have acquired Ashbringer just want to show up and take their sports car Ashbringer Fury Warrior out for a drive. So my call for Blizzard and Wild Strikes in particular would be to make Wild Strikes a passive ability for any Druid in the raid. It could be for a Boomy, it could be for a Guardian Druid running their other chest rune for more survivability, it could be for Restoration Druid, whatever it is, just make it a passive so that you don't have this gap and this need of a Feral Druid where if you don't have one, essentially the raid's not going to run. Next would be that world buff costs are somewhat insane again. Just like other materials at this point in time, the cost of Rune Cloth on Crusader Strike Alliance to supply world buffs to raids are crazy expensive. Prior to the dev announcement on slowing down SOD development, a set of world buffs would cost about 17 gold on Crusader Strike Alliance. Current prices for a set of world buffs on Crusader Strike Alliance are 248 gold. Just a 1,300% increase in cost for a set of buffs. Now, I think what could be done for this is just decrease the amount of commendations required for turn-ins, going from 5 commendations down to 1 commendation for world buffs, and it would do wonders. For the guys that organize raids and keeping SOD going, like myself, a change to maybe 1 or 2 commendations for a turn-in would go a long way. I would also say what could be helpful is adding the Tarnish Undermine Reals to both Naxx and Scarlet Enclave bosses. What this does is it takes the activity that's still happening on SOD and gets more items flowing in the economy due to the Tarnish Undermine Real crates, which would then bring down the cost of materials on the AH. So if Blizzard did not necessarily reduce the cost of commendations to get world buffs, being able to add Reals to Naxx and Scarlet Enclave bosses would allow for more items to flow into the economy and ultimately provide a higher supply and drive down prices. I think this would also be an acceptable solution. So with this all being said, I only think a few changes need to be made in order for SOD Era to be a successful experience. The first thing is that we need to get all the players who want SOD Era connected together. We all need to be on the same realm. So if that's PvP, moving to PvE or vice versa, or just opening up free character moves so people can, choose where they want to be, I think this is just so important in making sure that those who want to continue the exotic experience can be together with other people who are like-minded and make a healthier raiding population and community. The next would be adjusting the new level 60 new player experience to where it is a lot easier to get plugged into raiding, and that is done through making Remnants of Valor tradable and a little bit maybe easier to get sanctified gear through Scarlet Crafted gear. Now, the second one, maybe not as important. I think just making Remnants of Valor tradable or sellable on the AH, I think that in and of itself will make the new player experience way easier as somebody can get then plugged into an Naxx run without having to go through a farm soloable, which they cannot do by themselves. 3, I think that Blizzard needs to make Wild Strikes raid-wide without a Feral Druid. Make it so another class can do it. It doesn't need to be a Druid that brings it passively. It could be another class. Somebody needs to be able to bring Wild Strikes in addition to Feral Druid so that raids have people signing up and it doesn't feel like there's this huge crutch in order to find this one Feral Druid. And lastly, a combination of 2 things I would say is reducing the cost for world buffs by either changing and reducing the number of commendations needed to get a world buff off the vendors in Ironforge or the major capital cities for Horde, or you can introduce Tarnish Undermine Reals to both Naxx Rammus and Scarlet Enclave bosses, which would ultimately get more items flowing into the economy due to the crates and would bring down the cost of materials on the auction house. By implementing these changes, the players that want to continue SOD can do so together. A merged server would create a stronger and more healthy raiding community, and the new level 60 player experience would be a lot easier to integrate that individual into the raid scene. I hope Blizzard looks at these potential changes and would implement some of these or all of these. I think SOD can be a successful air experience, but certain things need to happen to make it successful.